Thank you all for being here. Happy to have you. We will be talking about maps tonight. We will be talking about winning maps, and we will be hearing from quite a few people. To start with, though, we are going to start with our big, exciting announcement of the mapping competition winners. So drum roll, please. And I want to say that this is no easy adventure. This was less than 3 weeks between when we announced the competition, and we had 28 submissions, all of them very good. We had lots and lots of conversation about how to evaluate them with quite a few advisors and evaluators weighing in, thinking through how we measure the priorities, because LACRA did not give a simple rubric because it's written as legal language. And part of what we were doing was trying to test out the legal language, how people would interpret it, and what that would end up looking like as people mapped it. So some of what we're talking about tonight is exactly that, what we learned, how we evaluated, and what happened when people went to draw maps. So the people who drew the maps were not just mapping, they were also reading language, thinking through how to balance priorities and put those priorities into actual districts. We had folks in high school, folks in college, folks well beyond, a wide mix from across the state. So right now, I am going to announce, if I can get my, there we go, top 5 Senate maps. Gavin Beckett from Dauphin County, Ryan Cedzos, Erie County, Kyle Hines, Center County, Michael Scross, Chester County, and Michael Waxenberg of Pike County. Amazing, the spread across the state. And for, this should say top 5 House maps, first error of the evening. I'm sure there will be others. Sean Cardinal from Berks County, Ryan Cedzos from Erie County, Jacob Moser from York County, Lexi Rodriguez from Allegheny County, and Michael Scross from Chester County. Normally, if we were in person, we would invite everybody to the front and we would clap. Let's all just clap. Congratulations to these winners. They did great work. And I can't invite them all to the front. Some of them are not with us. Some of them are. You will be hearing from a few of them as we talk tonight together. And then you'll be working with a few of them as we go into local breakouts. So those are our winners. I'm going to hand off now to Keith Forsyth, who is our Advocacy Advisor Coordinator. He's been with Fair Districts pretty much since the start. And he's going to give us a little analogy of kind of how we think about the criteria that we were looking at. We talked quite a bit about balancing criteria, and he's going to give us a little bit of some thought about how we balance criteria. So Keith.
We're all familiar with the criteria that we've all discussed about what makes a good district map: compactness, minimum splitting of counties or other political boundaries, fair representation for racial and ethnic minorities, lack of bias for or against the political party, and so on and so forth. Leaving aside the problem of how you measure that, there is no one map that gives you the most goodness on along all those criteria. It's just not possible. When you optimize a map for one criteria, inevitably most, if not all, of the other criteria get worse. So to illustrate this, think of the example of compactness, and just think of compactness in a non-technical shape. A compact district is one that's not spread out or shaped crazily. So the most compact districts would be stop sign shapes like hexagons, squares, and pentagon shapes like that. So if we were to optimize a map for compactness, you would see something like this. That is very close to the most compact district map you could have for the state of Pennsylvania. And you'll notice how each shape is, somewhat close to one of those simple geometric shapes. And if you know anything about Pennsylvania, you can see that basically none of those boundaries correspond with county boundaries or other geographical features. And as soon as you start moving those boundaries around to respect county boundaries or other features, then each district becomes more spread out and less compact. And the same is true for the trade-offs with the other criteria. So another way to think about it is you're going to design a new kitchen for your house without building any more onto it. You can either have more counter space or more floor space, but you can't have both. And so mapping is really just an extremely complex example of that, with the number of possible choices exceeding the number of protons in the universe. But the good news is that the maps that were drawn in 2011 showed extremely high levels, and they basically sacrificed every other criteria out there in order to achieve that goal. So, however less than that we settle on in 2022, they can still be better than those maps in terms of most or all of the criteria that people care about, even though they will not give us everything that we want along every criteria.
Thank you, Keith. You're going to be hearing a lot about criteria, and the next person you're going to hear from is Justin Villere. He's been working on the whole question of criteria with Draw the Lines for a number of years now, working with mappers. He's going to talk a little bit about what he and Draw the Lines have learned about criteria and balancing criteria. And they're also going to preview what Draw the Lines and Committee of 70 have planned for congressional maps. Fair Districts PA is focusing most of our energy on House and Senate maps, which is why we did this competition for House and Senate. Committee of 70 is pretty much taking the lead among our redistricting allies on the issue of congressional maps. So we want to hear from Justin about what they've learned, what they have planned as we go forward this evening. Justin.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it. I am going to share my screen as well. There we go. And just show a few quick slides about exactly what Carol said. So again, Draw the Lines PA, we are a project of the Committee of 70 based here in Philadelphia. We are a statewide nonpartisan exercise in citizen map making. We've been doing this for about 3 years now. We've had most of our submissions through these twice yearly competitions, very similar to the one that Fair Districts just ran. Most of them have been through congressional maps, and you can see the numbers there. We've been mostly focused on engaging young people in this project, and you'll note a lot of the winners that Carol announced tonight are young people themselves. So it's very exciting to have people who are either recent voters or people who will be voting for the first time starting in 2022 and beyond on these new maps. So a few of the things that we've learned, two more quick points on background. We, unlike the Fair Districts competition, which set guidelines as far as LACRA was concerned, we generally ask people to declare what values matter most to them and then ask them to map to those values. And then we were judged, or we were judging those maps based on how effectively they drew those maps. So that gave us a pretty interesting insight into not only how people balance those different criteria, but also what criteria matter most to them. So a few of the things that we learned, the big picture, congressional or the handful, about 60 legislative maps that were submitted to our competitions. The main takeaway is that Pennsylvania citizens are very, very good at this when they've got the opportunity to do this. So again, we're talking about metrics a lot tonight. On the whole, Draw the Lines maps were more compact, they were more competitive, and they were more proportionally representative than either the previous LRC maps, legislative maps, or the 2011 congressional map that was overturned. That wasn't hard to beat on the 2011 congressional map, as most of you know. We had approximately similar population deviation and majority minority district totals. across our maps. And then our mappers struggled a little bit with county splits, but that was mostly due to lack of computational ability before the newest version of Dave's redistricting and district builder come out. So we're excited to see what happens here. I might share these slides with Carol. We don't have to, some of you may want to look at these later, but this is a comparison. We won't have time to spend really digging into this data, but it's a comparison of our median maps on both the state house and Senate side, and then the congressional maps on how they stacked up to the old maps that were in force. And you can see generally our mappers were able to beat all of these metrics. And so, like Keith said, there's no one way to maximize every one of these goals, but we've learned that there is a way to do this better than the politicians have when you get the wisdom of the crowd working towards drawing maps. So what we're focused on now is we want to take all the knowledge that we've learned from the last 3 years, the 1,500 maps that have been submitted to our competition, and then put that into basically a composite map, which is a single map or a couple maps that articulate the different values choices that were important to our mappers, the baseline metrics, the median metrics that they met, and then the different regional trends. One of our mappers, I'm not sure if he coined this term, if he got it from somewhere, but he talks about regionality within a map, which is the idea. It's very similar to communities of interest, but I think if you scale it to a more congressional scale, where what regions want to be mapped together? The Laurel Highlands, the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania Wilds, the Main Line outside of Philly. What are the areas that people feel go into a good congressional district? So we have developed and are finalizing this map with our Citizen Map Corps, which is a group of elite mappers who have been former competition winners. Some of them on our team are competition winners tonight from the LACRA contest as well. And so they're located throughout the state. They're helping create this composite map. And we are going to be presenting that to the media, to legislators, and to the public in the coming weeks, so that there can be basically a first step that we want to show the General Assembly to help them start, because they are still waiting for some final adjustments to the data that will be officially used for this process. So we kind of own this time right now before that those maps are drawn. And so Dave's redistricting has all the data uploaded now. You can go draw your own map. They've got the 2020 census data up. And so District Builder, I believe, does as well. So you all can see how that process works, but we're excited to be releasing that soon. And again, you'll probably see this spider graph tonight in some of the community breakouts, but our notion, even the 2018 remedial map that was requested by the state Supreme Court, which was, I think, on most respects better than the 2011 map. Our initial first draft of the citizens map was able to beat that, beat most of those marks across these metrics using Dave's scale here. So we'll talk more about this tonight. If you want to get involved with the congressional mapping process, we're going to be working closely with Carol and the rest of the Fair Districts team throughout the coming months. And so you'll be hearing from us, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything like that. So thank you, Carol. I'm excited to be here.
Justin. Thank you, Justin, for joining us. I will say you will probably not be seeing spider graphs tonight because we had a lot of discussion about competitiveness and proportionality, and those are metrics that are featured pretty prominently in Dave's redistricting, and LACRA does not feature those metrics. Instead, we talk about bias, that a map can't be drawn to advantage or disadvantage a party. So we talk about bias measurements. We also looked at responsiveness measurements. We also looked at splits measurements. And Justin said that the draw the lines was easily able to beat the baseline in competitiveness and proportionality for the 2011, 2012 maps. the same was true with the mappers for sure. For this competition, all of them beat the bias and responsiveness of the 2011 and 2012 legislative maps, and with far fewer splits. We haven't finalized the exact numerics on that from the competition, from all the entries and from our winners, but the metrics were far better than that for the legislative maps. The one place that was not true was minority representation, which I think is what Justin said as well. The maps that we have were drawn carefully to meet Voting Rights Act requirements, and that shows up when you start measuring other maps against those. So we're going to hear a bit more about that, about the metrics, about what we saw. We talked to quite a few people who are deep into different kinds of work with maps, and one of those has been a very helpful advisor for us at Fair Districts PA. That's Dinos Gonatos. He is not a Pennsylvanian, but he was born in Montgomery County, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself, and he's going to talk about minimizing bias and what is sacrificed to do that, and what needs to be held in tension as we think about drawing a map that is not biased, and what he's learned in looking at maps here in Pennsylvania. So Dinos, handing it off to you.
Hey, thanks, Carol, and thanks for inviting me. And actually, while I was not born in Montgomery County, but I grew up there from the age of about 8 months or something. And I, went to high school there, and then later as an adult, I lived for a few years in Delaware County. And my family is still there in Delaware County, and well, they just moved from Montgomery County. And as Carol said, I have studied maps quite a bit, especially trying to make low bias maps. What I've done is sort of a little different tactic than people in this competition, which is I've, for the most part, been using machines to draw them, partly because I'm lazy. And although I've spent enough time with Dave struggling to get the population balance right, but also machines can evaluate thousands of different scenarios and can sometimes find solutions that a person couldn't or wouldn't. But one thing I've concluded from this competition is that there are people out there who can hold their own against a machine. So I got into this, it seemed after the 2011 congressional map debacle, that a big benefit to having a fair map would be a map with low bias, maps that would be drawn not to benefit either party. And that's what it seemed to me, one of the major things behind LACRA was by taking the map drawing out of the hands of politicians, you would automatically get a low bias map. By not having people with some sort of agenda, then you would end up having maps that would give each party a fair chance. And so I thought it would be easy to draw low bias maps. But that turned out not to be true. But first, what are good measures of bias? So just a few, then there are a whole bunch of different ones, but one is by measuring the amount of wasted votes. In other words, if one party overwhelmingly wins a few districts, like in Philadelphia, where one party does overwhelmingly win, and the other party scoops up a lot of districts with 7% margins, which are much tighter, but still safe enough for them to reliably win, that second party is going to get more seats. And so it's favored by the efficiency gap because they waste so many fewer votes. Another metric that I happen to like is, and it's one of the ones that, and all these metrics are in Dave's, is looking at the seats or votes bias. So what they do in Dave's is they say, well, if you had elections and the two different parties had two different vote shares, but let's suppose for the sake of argument that both parties scored 50%, would they both get 50% of the seats? And if one party gets more than 50% of the seats, then that's a built-in seats bias. So that's a measure that I use a lot, and there are many others. So my first step at low bias was just having a bunch of monkeys sitting at computers drawing maps. In fact, I wrote a program to do this, or adapted one that's out there. And the monkeys came up with lots and lots of maps, nearly all of which were way less biased than the ones drawn 10 years ago in Harrisburg, but they were still pretty biased. On the congressional side, referring to not the ones for this competition, which were the legislative ones, but the congressional districts, Governor Wolf's advisors drew maps that you thought would be favorable to Democrats. Governor Wolf, after all, is a Democrat, but they actually favored Republicans, just not as much as the original 2011 maps. And the court-ordered congressional plans had less. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, but Republicans still complained it was a gerrymander, when in fact it neutralized some, but not all, of the built-in bias. And the built-in bias comes just because, like in Pennsylvania, as in many states, Democrats tend to pack in cities, and so their votes tend to be wasted. And that creates, to some extent, a natural gerrymander. So while partisan map drawers are more than happy to aggravate that, given the few overwhelmingly Democratic districts in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, if you want to make a low bias map, you have to really do some work. And then how much bias you end up with also depends on what other measures you compromise. So while I've drawn zero bias maps, something else gives. It's kind of like what Tom Wolfe said about pilots. There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And definitely in Pennsylvania, compactness and minority representation are some dimensions where there are trade-offs. So let me just share one of my pictures here, if I can do it. Let's see. I'm trying to find this. So, whoops, I just didn't want to do that. Here we go. Can everybody see this chart? I'm just going to blow up and make it big. So this is an actual chart showing the bias in percent and the compactness from the Davis measure for the Senate competition entries. And what you want is you want to have a high compactness score and a low bias score. So you want to be in this area, but nothing's in this area. So here are the two lowest bias competition entries. And those are nice maps, but you sacrifice compactness to have that low bias. So again, this is where you want to be. Where you don't want to be is this corner, where you have high bias, but a crummy value of compactness. And that's actually space that's taken up by the current map. So let me unshare that. How do I unshare my screen or get somewhere different? Okay, so let me show you some other stuff. Can people see this now? This is a map that I drew that has basically zero bias. So this map, if you look at it, let me blow it up a little bit, has some pretty crummy features from the view of compactness. In Allegheny County, you're snaking around there with a lot of districts that are little tarantulas, like this one. And if I scoot over to Montgomery County, Montgomery County has the feature where it's got some snaky looking stuff. So in Montgomery County, you're taking the Republican areas here, and you're combining them with the more inner suburbs, which have a lot of Democrats in them, to balance out the Republicans and give you a fairly low bias overall score. So, and that's just kind of life. I mean, you have to make those compromises. And let me unshare my screen. Here we go. So in conclusion, it's kind of hard to do everything. And if you want to lower bias, you're going to have to do a lot of work. And these are not maps that are just, the low bias maps in particular are not ones that are sort of near the happy medium if a lot of monkeys draw them. They're way, way, way out on the tail, although not quite as far out of the tail as the ones Republicans do in 2011. And so that leaves the question, well, what's a fair map? Is it a fair map to have very low bias, or is it a fair map to have people blindfolded or have monkeys draw them who don't know any better? and you can argue that the monkeys don't have an agenda. They're not trying to do something on behalf of a political party, but maybe you have to do work and get out of the sort of the medium to create fair maps, depending on what your definition of fair is. And that's my question. I don't really have a good answer, but again, I appreciate the opportunity to work with you, and I enjoyed judging for this competition. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dinos. And that is a question that we tried very hard with LACRA to balance out, to say, you know, there are constitutional requirements, there are, you know, things that voters care deeply about, there are ways to represent communities. There's a lot of challenges, and so we've had some really terrific conversations here. I'm going to invite somebody who took those conversations and drew maps and won one, Michael Waxenberg. He's been thinking about this with Draw the Lines and with Fair Districts PA. He's going to talk about his own approaches to balancing criteria in drawing the map, and also a little bit, he has already taken the Census Bureau data. Dave's redistricting had that up and ready to use within 2 days, I think it was. They worked very quickly. And so Michael has already gone back over his map and tweaked it using the new data, and he might have some insights for us about how that adjustment is going to impact the maps as we go forward. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much, Carol. I know we're a little behind the agenda, so I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief. I do want to respond first to something Justin said. He was very kind in his praise of citizen mappers. I'm not sure we're necessarily better than the professionals at this. I would say we're pursuing very, very different objectives from the ones that the partisan professionals are pursuing. And that speaks to the point that there are as many different approaches to drawing any given map as there are mappers drawing it. We bring our own values, our own priorities, biases, technical skills, even our own personal artistic aesthetics to what looks good to us on a map. But we do all work within some common parameters. In this particular competition, of course, we were constrained specifically by LACRA, and LACRA set some of the priorities as well as defining the parameters. But there are some parameters we always deal with. And just to inform maybe the breakout sessions a little bit, I'll lay out some of those, maybe define them a little more clearly. We tended to divide the criteria into hard constraints and then softer goals. The constraints, the clearest one is contiguity. I mean, either a district is contiguous or it's not. Funnily enough, there's even some wiggle room there. There's a little spot down by the Brandywine separating Delaware and Chester counties, where the contiguity of Chester County itself gets messed up. So even there's some ambiguity. Population variance, it's a hard constraint, but each body governing the drawing of a map has to decide how close is close enough on population. VRA compliance, again, a hard constraint, but an ambiguous one, and one that changes from place to place based on the composition of the electorate and the disposition of the courts that have authority. And then we have the softer goals. I mean, compactness, there are different ways to measure it. There are different opinions about how much is enough and how much compactness is worth trading off against some other criterion. So that's a softer one. Respecting boundaries, county boundaries, municipal boundaries, precincts, geographic separators, communities of interest, all of these have to be traded off against each other. And lastly, at least those softer criteria have some legal standing. Then you've got the partisan or political ones like proportionality, responsiveness, competitive districts, and lastly, the treatment of incumbency, whether you should be able to favor incumbents, whether you should try to preserve the cores of existing districts. That was actually a favored criterion in this particular competition, but some of us prefer to draw from a blank sheet of paper and ignore the existing districts. We don't prejudice against incumbents, but we don't favor them either. The key point is it's an iterative process. It has a ton of trial and error and refinement. And as Keith said, we can't stress this point enough, there is no best map. And that's why we really need the governing authorities, whether it's the Legislative Reapportionment Commission or the government committees, to decide upfront what are the values that they're utilizing for assessing maps. Then we can start drawing maps that are meaningful and comparing them meaningfully. Otherwise, we're just throwing darts, basically. let's see. Clearly, the clearer those constraints and priorities are, the better the whole process will be. We hope that there will be a constructive conversation with the citizenry about what those priorities and criteria should be. The LRC is off to a good start in that area, but the jury's still very much out. Lastly, quick word on a couple of additional topics that Carol mentioned. Census data. It is out. We're working with it furiously in DRA. The impact varies at the congressional level. It really depends on what you're stressing. If you're trying to maintain combinations of counties that come to a perfect population number, you know, the migration of population or the shift of population from the center and northwest of the state down to the southeast can be pretty disruptive. And especially when you're drawing smaller districts for the legislature, you can have to do a lot of redrawing. In my particular case with my Senate map, my map actually got better. I was able to incorporate some improvements based on the census data. I reduced the divisions of counties, for example. So the impact is mixed. It really depends on which map you're talking about. Lastly, on prison gerrymandering, it's a terrible injustice, and we really should fix it. There are different ways to fix it. I think the solution may come down in the end to how hard it is to fix it the perfect way, which is to assign people where they actually live. If that's not feasible, there are other adjustments that could be made. Just to size the problem a little bit, though, there's a lot of talk about Forest County. Forest County is an absurd example. Yes, close to 40% of the population is incarcerated. That's nuts. But to keep it in perspective, that's less than half of 1% of that congressional district. You get down to legislative districts in the lower chamber in the House, it's about 5% of that House district, and then it starts to matter. But maybe we can come up with a rougher adjustment that doesn't get down to the level of individual inmates. That's really all I had. I look forward to the Q&A and to the breakout session, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Michael. And I will say, there've been some questions about seeing maps. You're going to look at maps in the breakout session. To try to look at 10 maps in a session like this would just blow all of our minds. It wouldn't really be helpful. We have shared the links, and we will be sharing the analytics as well in an update on our website in a day or two with an email pointing you towards the video, pointing you towards the metrics. So if you want to look more deeply, but we thought we'd start by having some conversations about what we're talking about, rather than share metrics and have people start to say, wait, which metrics did you use and how does this work? So we thought we'd have a conversation about this before that. The next person we have tonight is Ryan Cedzos, who mapped both House and Senate. Michael mapped them both, but Michael had some really elegant solutions for both. And I've asked him to talk a little bit about just the thoughts about kind of the difference in doing both of those. We've seen some interesting trends that are almost in contradiction between one chamber and the other in terms of balancing priorities. And there's also some problem areas, as Michael mentioned, one of those, the contiguity question around Chester County. There are some other problem areas. Ryan's going to mention a few of those. So Ryan, it's your turn.
All right. Hello, everyone. So with the difference between the state House and the state Senate maps, the biggest, of course, being the number of districts, the Senate having 50 and the House having 203. So because of this is what causes a lot of the trade-offs of metrics to change. So population deviation being one of them, it's a little bit easier to hit the marks in population when you're dealing with a Senate map, because I think the score you're aiming for is about 260,000 people per district. And then for the state House, it's about 64,000. And so just thinking about each precinct having a certain couple thousand of people, then it's going to be harder to hit right on the nose the metric that you're looking for with a state House, because for each precinct that you add to your district, it's going to make it's a larger portion of that makes up each individual district. And so this is especially true in some of the, especially like I think Lancaster County and Pike County. A lot of the precincts there have a lot of people. I think Pike County has a couple precincts in the 7,000 or 8,000 people. So when you're trying to add a precinct to one of those districts, it's really spikes the numbers. If you're mapping a district around Pike County and you have, for the state House, you have maybe a couple thousand off of what you need and you're looking for another precinct to add, even just adding one of those 7,000 or 8,000 precincts can put you way over the edge. And then in terms of compactness, it can also, I found that a lot of times it's harder to get compact districts with the house maps, because when you have, since the population, since you're looking at 203 districts instead of the 50 in the Senate map, you have less precincts per district. And so when you're trying to make a nice compact district, you're dealing with less precincts per district. So you have to go more with how the precincts are laid out than with how with the Senate maps, you're able to use a lot more precincts. And I think I can share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome. So this is my Senate map. So this has 50 districts in it. And so if you look at a couple of these, maybe over here on the right side here, the Northeast, you can see it's a pretty compact district. It's the most the 100% compact district would resemble a circle. But so a compact district is one that we're looking where it resembles one of the more simple geometric shapes. And then let me see if I can get to my house map. And now if we're looking in the same area, again, with the house map, it's a little bit harder to get a more compact district because all of the districts are smaller, of course, because you need 203 of them. So when we're looking at Pike County is what I was talking about before, where a lot of those, there's only a couple precincts in this entire district because all of them have a large number of people. So trying to, if you were either taking away a certain precinct or adding a certain precinct in that area would still make it difficult to create a compact district. And so a lot of, I think the average, I was looking at the averages for all of the contest submissions, and I think the average compactness for the state Senate was 66 and for the state House was around 33. So it's slightly lower. And then I found a little bit of a difference in the splits category in terms of county splits. The House maps actually did a little bit better at minimizing county splits than the Senate districts or the Senate maps, because since we're dealing with a lot more districts, the population of a district is more often smaller than the population of a county. And so you're able to fit more districts within a county, and that's able for you to kind of work around how you want to split a district, while with the Senate maps, a lot of times you get districts that have higher populations than counties, and you're splitting them across multiple districts. And looking at the average, the Days Redistricting app scores in splits, it was 71 for the Senate maps and 79 for the House maps. So it was a better score in terms of all the maps that were submitted. And so I found that in terms of the different metrics that you're looking at, the Senate maps is easier to have a more compact map that has a better population equivalence. While with the House maps, it's a little bit easier to avoid splitting, but it's harder to get that population equivalence and to get more compact districts. And then in a couple areas, I found Allegheny County I found to be not terrible with the state Senate maps. I think I can zoom in here. And here I use the rivers as natural boundaries as best as I could, because I consider rivers to be very good natural boundaries when kind of mapping out districts, and it almost a lot of times mapped itself. And so I was able to get some really good, a couple weird little areas, but I was able to get a really solid area of what I was looking for in terms of compactness and splits. But with my House map, I found a lot more difficult in the Allegheny area, because I kept the same idea of trying to map along the rivers. And this proved to be a lot more difficult when I was dealing with a lot more districts, because with the state House, so you're dealing with a lot more districts. And so I had a lot of districts that I had a lot of trouble with trying to fit in there and not kind of spiral all over the place. And another area that's always a lot of difficulty is the Philadelphia area. And I found that to be, it's always a difficult area to map, no matter if you're doing the state house, the state senate, or just the US congressional map for Pennsylvania. But between the difference between the state house and state senate, I found it to be not that much more difficult between the two. And yeah, that's all about I have. I think I can give it back to you. Am I still sharing? Oh, there it is.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. That's really helpful. I was not aware of the precinct issue up in the Pike area, and that raises some questions about, who decides when precincts need to be split. And I know that the counties are supposed to be doing that. And before the census and before the elections, it would be interesting to find out if there's anything that triggers forcing them to do that, because it seems like some counties don't get around to that. We're going to end our having presenters with Chris Fowler, who is going to talk a little bit about minority representation. And that is an area where there's real complexity in terms of what the law, there's the Voting Rights Act, but then there's some other considerations. And then that falls into tension with some of the other criteria that we're looking at. So Chris is going to give us some insight into that. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions, and then we will be going into breakouts. So Chris.
Hello, thank you. Carol, thank you for inviting me. And I'm sorry if my speech is a little slurred tonight. I've been programming since I think 6:15 this morning, and I'm absolutely just, there's nothing upstairs right now. So I'm gonna do the best I can with you all tonight. For someone who works with census data and with redistricting both, these are utterly the most busy days I can imagine. And we also start the semester on next week as well. So it's really interesting to see what's going on with redistricting all over the country right now. And wonderfully, there are all these really interesting conversations. And I'm pretty excited that we've gotten past the conversation should be open and transparent and shouldn't just be unfair to actually unpacking what those kinds of things mean. And Carol asked me to talk a little bit about minority representation. And most of you probably recognize that the Voting Rights Act is in place to ensure that underrepresented minorities have a chance to elect people who look like them to office. And this is called descriptive representation. And it's kind of an important concept because obviously people who look like you or who look like anyone else can represent all kinds of policy preferences. There's no reason why we can't have coalitions. But descriptive representation is a pretty important part of this, that as long as we are voting in ways that are racially polarized, this is an important part of what representation looks like. And the Voting Rights Act is meant to ensure that, to create some standards. One of those standards is to create majority-minority districts. And that general term applies specifically to Latino populations and African-American populations. It has also been used to apply in some very special cases to Southeast Asian, to various Asian populations in different parts of the country. But for the most part, in most times and places, we're going to be talking about making districts that are majority African-American or majority Latino. And the Latino majority ones are really only going to be in the Southwest. So we're really, if we're talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about making majority African-American districts. And the reason this gets complicated is because if you make a district majority African-American, you're almost certainly packing votes. And we know from our gerrymandering 101 that that's not a good thing. And it turns out, if you study this, it's a very difficult thing to study, just because we're missing a whole bunch of information. It turns out that if you have 37% of your Black, 30% of your voters are Black, you are almost certainly going to elect a Black representative to that district. It's just if you look at the data, and I'll just share, I've shown this to some of you in the past. Essentially, the green dots over here are members of the Black Congressional Caucus. Orange dots are not. You can see a scattering. There's a random person in Utah, another super conservative dude in Texas, but everyone over here, with the exception of sort of an exceptional person in Tennessee and then Steny Hoyer down in Maryland, every person in this range is a member of the Black Congressional Caucus. And we even get a pretty significant scattering of them in Democratic districts down in the low 30s and even the high 20s. But the Voting Rights Act has you place districts up here. And the problem with that is it's essentially packing, and it means that issues important to this group of individuals are going to be concentrated in one place, and it reduces the likelihood that those same individuals will have representation from other non-majority African-American districts. And that's really where the tension comes in. Furthermore, as we're doing mapping, a lot of the basic software combines Latino and African-American populations. And in Pennsylvania, that's not necessarily an appropriate thing. These two groups of people, as diverse as they are internally, they're extremely diverse when set side by side. There may be tremendous commonalities around some things, but big differences in other areas. So one of the things I saw a lot in judging maps for Draw the Lines, for example, is people would make a minority-majority district that was 25% African-American and 25% Hispanic. That doesn't actually really make sense from a descriptive representation point of view. It doesn't make sense in terms of increasing the policy voice of those communities. It really ends up just sort of arbitrarily, giving yourself a pat on the back for getting that district. So the two things I really want to take home are, a district that increases the voting power of Black communities in Pennsylvania should aim for around 37 to 40% African-American voting age population. That's kind of the back of the envelope metric. If you see something going up in the 50s or 55 or 60, you're looking at packing, and it's not helpful. Now, where this gets really complicated is you could have a district challenged under the Voting Rights Act for not having a majority-minority population. Now, it's interesting who has standing to make that, and there's some legal arguments that are not something I'm going to get into while my tongue is as tied as it is. But it isn't required that these districts exist so much that their outcome, their positive outcome of electing a Black representative occurs. If that can occur with less than 50%, then you don't need the 50%. And so it's important to remember that this is a choice that can be remedied if it's not working out. But if it does work, it's a way to increase Black representation in the state. So just when you're thinking about how many districts I can get, don't arbitrarily combine different kinds of minority populations. That's not cool. But also sort of think about what can we do to increase representation. I guess the final caveat to that is there's an enormous Latino population in Pennsylvania, but it's spread so dispersed across the state that there really isn't any way to create a significant Latino district in this state. So think about that as sort of what are our larger needs for increasing ways where big communities of interest, like the Latino community, any community of interest, can have a voice have good representation, good responsiveness in terms of their elected officials. I think that's all I got, Carol. Sorry.
That's great. No, that's good. So we've opened up a number of topics here. There's obviously lots of things to be held in tension. It's complicated. And I think the one thing that I'm hoping that you take away is you can't just look at a map and say, oh, that's a good map. A good map has a lot of different pieces to it. And when you maximize one thing, sometimes you minimize something else and you run into trouble. But we do want to make clear that we can kind of establish baselines for what we expect. So we expect something that has high bias, we can say there's a rationale and we don't accept that, or maps that are incredibly uncompact and don't make up for it in other ways, then we can say, well, there's something else going on here. So the more we understand about this, the more we can advocate for fair maps. And that's part of the point here, is that we're not just saying, oh, keep my community together or make districts that look nice. We need to be more sophisticated in what we're asking for and more sophisticated in how we advocate for that. I've seen a couple of questions that we can't go too deeply. We've had lengthy conversations about the Day's proportional metric. And we are not using that for this competition because it is a confusing one, and there's kind of the way they define it is anti-majoritarian map. So if you have a map that if you get more than a majority of the votes and you don't get more than a majority of the seats, it's anti-majoritarian. But as Dinos pointed out, most maps in Pennsylvania are going to end up with a proportionality of 0. And we had some really terrific maps that had and they don't even give you a gradation down. It's like there's a cliff that you fall off of. And all of my most beautiful maps have had a 0 in proportionality because I'm working on other things. So I am personally offended by that score. But if you look at the bias score, I think that's much more appropriate to what we're trying to accomplish. Anyhow, we're going to go into breakouts. I just want to answer a few questions about the prison question. We do know that the data is available. We asked the Department of Corrections to take a snapshot on April 1st, 2020 Census Day of where the people who were in prison at that time, where they were from. And so they do have that data. The one little place that there's a question is people who have been there for decades. Is there a real point of, a home address? Some of them, yes. Some of them, at that point, the prison is where they are. And we would say just remove those from the count rather than try to reallocate them to a home address. But that data is available and could easily be swapped in for where people are counted. So that's an easy fix if the Legislative Reapportionment Commission decides to take it. Thanks for being here tonight.